Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today I would like to take part in another BookTuber tag. This is a fantastic tag called Beauty in Books. And this is a tag that was created by Emily at the Linguists Library and Ruben at To Readers It May Concern. And I was tagged by the wonderfully generous and affirming Emily. This tag is divided into 8 parts, or there are 8 prompts, and I would like to divide each prompt or part into 3 smaller subdivisions. So firstly, I would like to look at the prompt in regards to fantasy literature, which, as I've said in previous videos, is a genre I just love, going right back to its early sort of 19th century origins, and I guess romance literature even before that, right through into the medieval period. So first of all, I would like to look at the literature of fantasy. Then I would like to look at the literature of ancient Greek tragedy, followed by I can't talk about beauty without referring to my Billy Blue. So part 3 is going to be a little meditation on this beautiful hound that I live my life with, the love of my life. So part 1 I will do fantasy literature, part 2 I will look at ancient Greek tragedy, and part 3 my Billy Blue. The first prompt is beauty in concept. This is such a fantastic idea for a BookTube tag. Beauty in concept. For me, I think I had to go back. I had to return to Ursula K. Le Guin and the multiverse that she created with her Earthsea stuff. I just love the fantasy work of Ursula Le Guin. As I've said in previous videos, I don't read much science fiction, so I haven't read some of her more adult science fiction works. But her work on the multiverse of Earthsea, I just love. And in terms of a concept, I've always read this book in terms of its initial concept of, world creation and creating this whole world of Earthsea. I've always seen it as a type of version of that Bronze Age Mediterranean world, of archipelagos and islands and seas, and everything is to do with ships and the movement of ships and that maritime industry. And of course, in that Bronze Age world, you've got this wonderful majesty, don't you, of Egypt, which was already an ancient society in the Bronze Age. All the pyramids and the mortuary practices and pharaohs and all that exotica, if you like. And then in the north of the Mediterranean world, in that northeast, you had, of course, the Hittite Empire. And of course, they extended their influence all the way down to Great Troy. And then, of course, you've got references to the Trojan War and Greeks against the Trojans and princesses and the abduction of princesses and how that launched 1,000 ships. And then, of course, returning back to the Greek world, you've got in Knossos, you've got the great Minoan King Minos, and, of course, the labyrinth that was said to exist beneath his great palace at Knossos, with the Minotaur, the monster, at the heart of it, being fed the best, the youngest of the Athenian beauty every year. And then, of course, you've got those incredible Mycenaean shaft graves and lion gates, and all of this, I think, is sort of what Ursula K. Le Guin had in mind in terms of her concept. Or that's how I read the origins of her concept, of this world creation that she did with this. But the other thing I love about Ursula Le Guin's concept is the way she was able to transform with it. Fantasy literature is often a literature of nostalgia. It can be a very conservative, a very conventional type of literature. Ursula Le Guin was able to do something, I think, in terms of concept, a little more interesting than just that. She accepted as a very young woman, she accepted that when she came to write her story, her first Earthsea book, as a young woman, she just accepted that the hero, the protagonist, of course, had to be male. And so she wrote the first book in this great multiverse with Ged, the young mage, the apprenticeship, the growing up of this young wizard who would become the greatest mage wizard of his age. She initially wrote the hero as male, but she very quickly, as a young adult herself, discovered feminism and realized that she had a responsibility to write things differently, to do things differently. And she very quickly in this multiverse began to write subsequent books with the female as hero and protagonist. And I just love seeing how this Earthsea multiverse is transformed by Le Guin in concept. For me, that transformation, that capacity to evolve, to change, to grow as you take on new philosophies and ways of being in the world, part of, for me, what makes this concept really beautiful are those transformations. So that's part one of my first prompt. Greek tragedy. For me, the great translator of ancient Greek tragedy has always been Anne Carson. They are always the translations that I've probably spent most of my time reading, rereading, spending my time with. But of course, there are so many other great translations of Greek tragedy, aren't there? And this is one that I love. She was actually an American poet, but lived nearly all her adult life in the United Kingdom after marrying an Englishman. This is by Ruth Fainlight. And I just love this. This is a translation that she did of 3 of the plays, the Theban plays of Sophocles. And I really love Ruth Fainlight. She was a very close friend of Ted Hughes and in particular Sylvia Plath. So she was part of that sort of milieu, I suppose. And I really love her poetry. She's a wonderful poet in her own right. I really enjoy her poetry. And I really enjoy her translations of these 3 Theban plays by Sophocles. They're tremendous. But as I said, for me, in terms of concept, the great translator of ancient Greek tragedy has always been Anne Carson. This is just one of the books that she did. And in terms of a concept, I just get bowled over by this. This is an Oresteia. Of course, in the ancient world, there are many Oresteias retelling, if you like, the legacy of the homecoming, what happened after the Trojan War finished, when Agamemnon returned home. And the concept part of this that I really enjoy is, of course, going to Attic theatre, the great theatre of Dionysus there in Athens. Going to this was considered to be a civic responsibility. It was a civic duty. All male citizens, of course it was only men, all male citizens were expected, as well as voting and taking part in the democracy of Athens, they were expected to go to the theatre. And of course, Greeks being Greeks, everything was boiled down to, in a sense, crude competition. So every afternoon at the theatre was a performance usually of 3 plays by 3 different playwrights, with a satyr play thrown in for good measure as, farce and parody. But often, of course, they were 3 great tragedies by 3 great tragedians. And so this is, in a sense, what Anne Carson has given us here in her version of the Oresteia, of the homecoming of Agamemnon from the Trojan War. And I just love this. Anne Carson, in this particular project, has translated the play Agamemnon by Aiskhylos. There's Elektra by Sophocles, and then there's the Orestes by Euripides. So you've got these 3 great Athenian tragedians, and one play by each of them, almost like it really is, for us, returning to the scene of the crime, returning to Athens in that highlight, you know, that 100-year period when all of this stuff happened. You know, the Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian Wars, the beginnings, the flowering of Greek drama, so much Greek poetry, so much was going on. It's just an astounding time. So I love the concept of this. You know, in a sense it's an incomplete concept, I suppose, because Anne Carson has given us the 3 plays, and it's really interesting because, of course, Aiskhylos was right at the beginning of this flowering, right at the beginning of that 100-year period. Sophocles comes in the middle of it, and Euripides, of course, is right at the end. So Aiskhylos is writing at the time just after the Persian Wars, when Athens is really on the rise and you know, in the ascendancy, the beginning of the Delian League, and all that wealth from the whole called Athenian Empire flowing back to Athens. And you know, there was so much money in Athens, so much wealth to create great buildings like the Theatre of Dionysus and other temples and things up on the Acropolis, and so much was going on, building the Athenian navy. So Aiskhylos was really writing at a time of Athenian ascendancy when they really didn't think anything could ever go wrong. Sophocles was in that middle period, I suppose at the height of the Delian League and wealth. And then of course Euripides comes during the time of the Peloponnesian War, when, because of this internal strife, this terrible bickering between Athens and Sparta, and they literally just tore one another apart. And while Sparta won the Peloponnesian War and Athens came out of it very poorly, Sparta didn't do too much better, really. And that really was, you know, the end of Greek as we, I suppose, consider it. And then we had, of course, the rise of Macedon, northern Greece under Philip and then Alexander. And they united the whole of the Greek world underneath their ascendancy for a short time, because we all know what happened to Alexander. So I think this is a beautiful concept. I just love what Anne Carson has done to this. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this book as we go to subsequent prompts. Billy Blue, oh my goodness, beauty in concept. I've said this in previous videos. When Billy Blue came into my life, I was in a really bad place. You know, I really was within 2 weeks of a dead-free, guilt-free end, a dead-on, guilt-free end. I really was. My partner at the time knew that I was very close. I had all my plans in place, I'm ashamed to say. It was just the way it was. And when this dog came into my life, oh my God, beauty in concept. Talk about transformation. Within 2 weeks, I was a different person. All I wanted to do was to get well and literally save the day for that Billy. I'm pointing over here because he's, of course, laying right at my lap. Billy is never more than 2 meters away from me. He is just such a beautiful, beautiful hound. Oh, I owe him so much. Beauty in concept. The second prompt. Beauty in an opening line. Oh, wow. All right. Beauty in an opening line. First of all, fantasy. One of the most famous opening lines, I think, of any fantasy novel, particularly given the history that it was written when the writer was actually marking examination papers and he was bored out of his brain, you know, bored off his scone, and he turned over a piece of paper and he wrote on the back side of it these lines. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell. Not yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. Oh, The Hobbit. One of my favourite books of all time, and what an opening line. And particularly when we have the pedigree, you know, we actually have the moment recreated for us when Tolkien was in that exam room marking papers and he turned over an empty sheet and he wrote that. Oh wow, the beginning of so much. And then listen to this. Ooh. This is the opening line of Agamemnon by Aiskhylos. This is just fabulous. Here's a watchman, a soldier, who's on, watch duty, looking for the flames to be lit to tell them that the Greeks have finally, after 10 years, been successful and won the war. This watchman, he doesn't even come up again in the rest of the play. He's given this long monologue, this speech at the opening of Aiskhylos' play, and we sort of fall in love with this character, and then we don't see him again. I love Aiskhylos. I love the way he's inventing, tragedy as he goes along. He's inventing the mores, the structure of the whole thing. You can see the whole thing, the architecture being put in place. Oh, I just love this. So here's the beginning, the opening of Aiskhylos' Agamemnon. Gods, free me from this grind. It's one long year. I'm lying here watching, waiting, propped on the roof of Atreus, chin on my paws like a dog. I'm peered at the congregation of the nightly stars, bright, powerful creatures blazing in the air. The ones that bring summer, the ones that bring winter, the ones that die out, the ones that rise up. And I watch for this sign of a torch, a beacon light sending from Troy the news that she is captured. Those are the orders I got from a certain man-minded woman. But whenever I take to my restless, dreamless, dew-drenched bed, I cannot close my eyes. Fear stands over me instead of sleep. And whenever I think to sing or hum a tune to stay awake, then my tears fall. Oh, wow, this watchman standing, waiting for the torches to be lit. Oh, I just love that opening line from Aiskhylos. Here's the opening line from the Bakkhai by Euripides, a completely different sort of play. Oh, actually, this isn't by Euripides. This is actually, Carson wrote a poem as a preface or as an introduction to her translation of this play, the Bakkhai by Euripides. So this is actually a really cool sort of opening sentence explaining her own project by Carson. Dionysus is God of the beginning, before the beginning. What makes beginning special? Think of your first sip of wine from a really good bottle. Opening page of a crime novel. Start of an idea. Tingle of falling in love. Beginnings have their own energy, ethics, tonality, colour. Oh, I just love that. The idea of writing an introduction like that in verse and having it so richly dramatic and evocative, it's just beautiful. And you can see this is a beautiful little hardback book I bought with a magnificent painting on the cover. It's just a beautiful, beautiful book. I just adore Anne Carson's translations. What have we got? Opening line, the Bakkhai. Okay, opening line with Billy. Oh my goodness. I described this in my last video, didn't I? Hounded, where I reread the first 2 chapters from that autobiography in verse that I'm writing. When Billy came into my life, yes, he completely transformed me. As soon as he came into our house, he just loved our small townhouse turned kennel. I loved the suburb of Sunshine where I was living, this lovely suburb, in the western suburbs of Melbourne. And he just adored me from the first moment he crossed our threshold. He just loved me. He was my dog and I was his. We had this bond right from the beginning, and he's just the same now. He just loves me to bits. Oh, he's completely transformed my life with love. But in terms of opening lines, it wasn't all good. When he came to me, he was literally a skeleton. He was so underweight. Oh, it was quite distressing to see, actually. And the poor boy, his skin, when you rubbed his belly in places where there was exposed skin, his skin was like touching old chamois. And some of his coat, it was literally like touching old sandpaper or something. He was in a really bad way. I don't know. He was quite a successful dog, and I would have thought he would have been treated really, really well. I don't know in the racing industry whether they keep dogs, really lean. The less weight means they can run faster, and maybe it means they're more aggressive to taste that lure. I don't know. But when he came to me, he was in a really bad place. So our opening line, was on one side of the coin. It was all full of transformation and love for me. And he just loved everything about me and my townhouse and our suburb. Oh, what a dog. Baptism of absolute love and graciousness. But the other side of the coin was he was physically in a bad place. And for the first 12 months that I had him, he was just so hungry. It didn't matter what I put in his bowl, he would just eat it. I thought he loved all sorts of things, raw eggs, raw chicken necks. I thought he enjoyed all sorts of things. I loved just putting a raw egg into his bowl once a day, and you would see him just race to the bowl and eat it, and he would chew that raw egg because I wouldn't smash it or anything. I would just put it in whole for him, and he would get it up, and I thought he just loved the experience of having the whole thing, burst asunder in his mouth as he cracked the hole and bit into it. I just thought he loved it, and he used to lick the bowl and not leave anything left. But I've now discovered that now that he is in the land of plenty and he started to slow down and realise that, there's always plenty of food now and really good food, I spend a lot of money on that gorgeous dog. But now that he's done that, he's become a very fussy eater, and he won't now, he's very funny, he won't eat anything raw. He won't touch raw eggs. He won't eat raw chicken necks, raw bones. He won't eat anything raw. He likes what I eat. I've got to be very careful that I make sure there's no, onion or garlic or salt or anything that's bad for him. He's such a beautiful dog. I am so in love with that hound. Beauty in character. Oh boy. You can see, I think you can probably hear from my voice, I've been excited about this tag for 2 weeks. I had a few other tags to do first, and it was sort of in a line, and when I found out that this was the time to do this tag today, I hear, I think from my voice, I'm very excited. I've really been very energized and excited about this tag. Beauty in character, fantasy. Well, for me, there are so many places, like you could go to all sorts of places, couldn't you? Boy. But what I'm going to go to is Susan Cooper. Susan Cooper was a wonderful English fantasy writer who has actually lived most of her adult life in the United States. She's written quite a few books. The books that I really love and I always return to are this Dark is Rising sequence. This is a retelling, or an appropriation probably more is a better way of putting it, of the Arthurian myths and legends into modern day Cornwall. I just love these books by Susan Cooper. I return to these every 3 or 4 years, certainly every 5 years, which is why I've got these beautiful new hardback editions. I used to have these in an old, they were largely second-hand paperbacks, and they literally just fell apart because I had reread them so many times. So I've upgraded my Susan Cooper library and brought these beautiful matching lovely hardback books. They're quite cheap paper, but they open beautifully in the hand. They're lovely hardback books with lovely matching covers, so they look beautiful on the shelves. And these are now the copies that I return to as I'm reading and living with The Dark is Rising. The character in here that I want to talk about is the character of Merlin. In this universe, the character of Merlin is transformed. Again, I love that word, transformation. In this universe, Merlin is transformed into a character known as Great Uncle Gummery. This sequence of novels is all about children. Children are the heroes, both boys and girls. So Susan Cooper really had a good ear for that representation of gender. But uncle to all of these kids is Great Uncle Gummery, Merlin. And Great Uncle Gummery, oh boy, he's such a dramatic, richly character. He's sort of a mixture somehow of, Merlin meets Doctor Who, meets, any of those sort of ancient wizard type for this Gandalf, whatever you like. But there's a lot of Doctor Who, a lot of humour thrown in, time travel, Great Uncle Gummery, oh, and of course Indiana Jones, because Great Uncle Gummery is an archaeologist with a real tinge of Indiana Jones about him, although this predates, I think, the whole Indiana Jones type thing. But, you know, if you can imagine an Indiana Jones meets the Wizard meets Doctor Who, you've sort of got what I have in mind with trying to describe Great Uncle Gummery. And he always leaves it for the kids to solve the puzzle, to rescue the day, to, you know, resolve the complication. He just knows when to step in, when to help, when to facilitate, and when to allow the kids to find their own way of doing things. And, oh, I just love it. I really do. Oh, I love these books. Susan Cooper, The Dark is Rising sequence. Character, beauty in character. Coming back to an Oresteia by Anne Carson, I think the character that most stands out to me, because she is a real hinge, she sort of stands in the middle of all three of these plays, is Clytemnestra, the wife of Agamemnon. Clytemnestra, such an interesting character. You know, on the one side of the coin, she is described as husband killer, because when Agamemnon comes home, Clytemnestra has already taken a lover, and she woos Agamemnon after 10 years of fighting in Troy, and he's the great king of the Greek forces, of course. She woos this great Bronze Age warrior king into the bathroom, and as he's having a bath, she murders him. So she, on one side of the coin, she is husband killer, you know, worst, and of course committing adultery as well. So you can imagine the sort of way that Clytemnestra is often described by men in the world of these plays. But on the other side of the coin, of course, Clytemnestra has been much put upon by Agamemnon, who may be this great warrior king, this great Bronze Age warrior, hero of Troy, but he was a beast. He was terrible. Clytemnestra had been married before him, and her husband had died. And the first thing Agamemnon did after they got married, apparently, was to murder her 2 children. Can you believe it? And then, at the beginning of the Trojan War, the gods are angry with Agamemnon for various reasons. Probably for good reason, because Agamemnon was not a nice bloke. So the gods stilled all the winds, so that this huge, fleet of 1,000 ships couldn't sail from Greece to Troy. And if things didn't change quickly, of course he knew that he would lose control of the Greek forces and they'd all return home, and that would be the end of winning back Helen of Sparta, now known as Helen of Troy, but she was actually a Spartan, of course. So Agamemnon is told by the gods the only way he can get the winds to turn in his favour is by luring his daughter, his now daughter with Clytemnestra, out to the field, pretending that she is being called to marry the great hero Achilles, who everyone of course wants to marry, that great bisexual Bronze Age warrior. But when she's wooed to the field, thinking that it's her marriage day, she's actually going to be sacrificed by the Greeks, and Agamemnon is going to slit her throat as a sacrifice to secure the better winds. So Agamemnon was a horrible, horrible person. So you can understand why Clytemnestra hated him. And she couldn't wait for him to get home so she could get her revenge. And of course, tragedy is all about revenge, bloodshed, great misery. And Clytemnestra knew great misery. She's often described by men simply as husband killer. But there's a lot more to the story than just that. Character, my Billy Blue. Oh, my Billy Blue. He's just so gentle and quiet. He's so affectionate. And the thing I love, of course, most about his character is he's like an Australian Kelpie dog. A dog that's, out chasing sheep and cattle and, running around all day long. He's not running around all day long. He's like a koala. 4 hours of big activity and 20 hours of sleep in his bed. But he is my dog. He's a one-man dog. He's mine, and he knows that I'm his. Oh, what a character, my Billy Blue. Beauty amidst pain. Oh, for me, I couldn't go past this book. This is by Giroux, The Buried Giant. This book knows such pain. This is described as a sort of a magical realist, or even as a work of fantasy, I guess. The great Nobel Prize winner. But if it is a fantasy, it's a very different type of fantasy. This is very much a grown-up work. It's dealing with the forgetting, and how forgetting might be important in getting over trauma, and getting over, in particular, the trauma brought about by war. The loss, the devastation, the terrible things that happen in war. Arthur, all that whole Arthurian world, the collapse of that Arthurian world in the sort of, at the end of the Roman period in Britain, and the beginning of the Anglo-Saxons coming in, and the beginning of Anglo-Saxon Britain. This book is all about that type of thing, that milieu. But this is very much a slow burn. This is not a fantasy novel that is action-packed and that you're turning the pages to find out what's going to happen next. In actual fact, very few things happen. This is about pain. It's about characters living with pain, and possibly about the role of forgetting as being the only way of coming to some sort of terms with pain. And in particular, the characters in this novel are two beautiful an old married couple who go on a type of pilgrimage to find their son. And I think we all know what's happened to the son. But it's this beautiful pilgrimage by this old married couple who have the most beautiful, gentle relationship with one another. It's a magical book. A real slow burn. It's very much just focused on these characters, the pilgrimage that they go on, and the way they attract other people to in a sense, join them on this pilgrimage. It's a magical book. I really recommend it. If you want a sort of a type of fantasy dealing with trauma, the legacy of war, the role of forgetting as a way of somehow surviving that legacy and trauma, a beautiful slow burn, beautiful intimate portrait and character study. It's a wonderful, gentle meditation on character. Just a beautiful, beautiful book. And I've already done my Billy Blue, haven't I? I started with him. I'm getting too excited, you see. Beauty amidst pain. Well, I suppose I've talked about the pain with Billy. For Billy, it really was how he came to me so hungry. The other interesting thing about my Billy with pain is that he had half his right front paw amputated as a result of a racing industry. Apparently it's quite common with the greyhounds because they race in that circular way, so the outside leg has a lot of stress on it as they turn those corners on the racetrack, apparently, and it often causes a stress fracture, which is either very expensive to get treated by a vet, or of course it's much cheaper simply to amputate half the front paw. And that's why he got out of the racing industry and why I was able to adopt him, because after that he was never quite as quick again, of course. And my poor Billy, when he came to me, if ever he was down, if ever he was a little bit down on himself, down in the dumps, he would start limping straight away. And there was nothing wrong with his right foot anymore, his paw. But it obviously had that memory. It was built into his poor little brain. And whenever he was a little bit down, a little bit stressed, a little bit worried, about anxious about what was going on, like if I was getting ready to leave, if I was going to go to the gym and leave him or anything like that, and I don't leave him at all anymore because he suffers from such separation anxiety. And this separation anxiety would manifest in his body, and he would actually start to limp, and that little right paw would always manifest with that anxiety or that fear. So yes, Billy actually has this physical manifestation, and it still is to this day. Beauty in incompleteness. I think for this, I have to return. I think, for this to Tolkien. Tolkien, that perfectionist who was hardly ever able to finish anything. Thank God we got The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, because he didn't finish anything else. The great Anglo-Saxon scholar and philologist, the scholar of Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse, he spent a whole lifetime at Oxford University teaching, translating, working on Beowulf. And when he died, it still wasn't finished. And his son Christopher had to pull the whole thing together and bring it together into a book. And now, of course, because Tolkien is such a huge industry, lame people like me spend all our money on these beautiful deluxe hardback editions, buying a book that is not even actually complete. And Tolkien, even though I think if he had have had his choice, he would have been a poet. I think Tolkien, if he had have had a major talent, he would have done the whole of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings in verse. That would have been his, his great fortune. He did the whole thing in prose, and this, of course, includes his translation of Beowulf. He wasn't up to doing an alliterative verse translation. The great Seamus Heaney, I'm going to do an episode on the great Seamus Heaney's verse translation, the alliterative verse translation by Heaney of Beowulf next week. So that's to look forward to. But Tolkien's version, which is incomplete when he died, is written in prose. But it's still a beautiful thing to have. I just love the story of Beowulf. As I've said before, I love any stories about monsters and dragons. The other one, of course, is Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is a book that Tolkien is almost a collection of short stories, is the best way to look at it. This was started literally before World War I, and he wrote bits of it in the trenches, apparently, of World War I, before he got injured and was sent home to England. And at the time of his death in 1973, it still wasn't finished. And once again, it was up to his son, Christopher, to compile the whole thing, to bring it all together, to edit it, and to bring it out, because there was just, by then, of course, the Tolkien industry had just taken over. And, it didn't matter. People just wanted to buy these books. So this is a collection of short stories, which, again, was incomplete at the time of his life. Going back to the ancient Greeks, this book reminds me, of course, in terms of incompleteness, this book reminds me that, we so often, even people like me that try and pride ourselves on being more progressive, left of centre thinkers, it's so easy to get caught up in male writer after male writer after male writer, as though that's a complete sense of what it's like to be in this world. And we forget women. And this beautiful book by Emily Hauser, How Women Became Poets, this is a fantastic book reminding me that there were women poets in Britain as well. And not only Sappho. She looks at the priestesses of the Delphic oracle in Delphi, and she looks at all sorts of other examples of classical Greek female writers. So she reminds me all the time of incompleteness, of how it is incomplete to only focus on the males, that there is this other side to the story. The other thing about incompleteness, of course, with this, is that I always like to think, and if I ever met Anne Carson, I think I would tease her a little bit. She forgot to throw in a Sartre play. When you went to the afternoon to fulfill your civic duties and go to the theatre, the Theatre of Dionysus, you got 3 plays, usually tragedies, although comedies in the later on period became very popular as well by Aristophanes and by other people like that. But often you got the 3 big grown-up plays, often tragedies, and of course there was always a Sartre play thrown in. And Anne Carson, she's given us the 3 tragedies by 3 different tragedians, and she's forgotten the Sartre play. Oh, that would have been great to have had that farce and parody somewhere in the middle of this to break all the tension and to lighten everything up. So, incompleteness. And of course, in terms of Billy Blue, well, I'm desperately hoping that my shared life with him is far from complete. He's just turned 9. I have been told that racing greyhounds that have done a lot of racing, they often only live until about 10 or 11 if you're very lucky. And he did a lot of racing. He was a very successful dog, apparently. So he's already turned 9. He's in really great condition at the moment. I spend a lot of time and effort looking after him, brushing his teeth and giving him other oral care and, getting him to the vet. And I really look after him with the best of food and all that sort of stuff. So I'm desperately hoping, I've got another 3 or 4 years with Billy. I don't know what I will do when I don't have Billy, but that's, hopefully I don't have to worry about that. So my shared life with my Billy Blue is, I'm hoping, far from complete. Please. Beauty in place. Whoa. Well, for me, you've seen this sitting on my shelves in the backdrop of all my videos. This is the great Gormenghast by Mervyn Peake. Mervyn Peake was a fantasy writer, mid-20th century English fantasy writer. And he's often seen, again, we look at men, don't we? Men, 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 men. We often look, people or critics often look at Mervyn Peake and Tolkien as being like the twin fathers of modern day fantasy. Mervyn Peake's fantasy world is a very different world to Tolkien. These are not a world where there's a great adventure. You know, they're not page turners in that way. There's almost no magic in this book, believe it or not. There are no monsters, no dragons, nothing like that. Mervyn Peake's world, it almost reminds me when I'm reading an Iris Murdoch novel. You know, what you have here is a group of people, many of them quite nasty and not very nice people. And you've got these not very nice people forced to live together against a backdrop of incredible scenic beauty. So Gormenghast is this great castle, maze-like, labyrinth-like castle that has just grown and grown and grown over the generations and generations of the Groan family. Yes, that's right, the Groan family, who live in this great labyrinth-like castle. And there are whole groups of people who spend their entire life living inside this castle and never ever go outside. And when people do go outside, and very few people do, so the labyrinth, you know, the castle itself is this ramshackling labyrinth type thing. Half of it is literally falling apart and falling down and has been closed off because it's unsafe to enter. And then outside, even though there is a type of great scenic beauty and majestic, you know, cliffs and forest and all sorts of things outside, it's also a type of, you know, much of it is like a septic marshland, and it's almost like the way the characters are inside this labyrinth of a castle is projected out onto, you know, through the pathetic fallacy, is projected out into the sheer rock faces, the hardness of these cliff lines, you know, overshadowing back onto the castle, and these septic marshlands and bogs, and oh, it's an incredible place that Mervyn Peake here has created. The other thing I love about Mervyn Peake is his background. He was not an academic or a philosopher. His background was as an artist, and he did some beautiful work. He did a lot of work, for example, illustrating books. He actually illustrated my favourite version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. If you can ever find the Mervyn Peake illustrated edition of Frankenstein, grab it, because it's absolutely majestic. But you can see the Folio Society, oh my goodness, they really pulled out all stops on this. You've got this incredible labyrinth-like cover to represent the castle, and then you open it up, look at this, and you've got these 3 books, the 3 volumes of the Gormenghast trilogy set in this beautiful thing. It's just the most magnificent thing. It cost me quite a little sack of cash, but I'm so glad I bought it. It's just majestic. Mervyn Peake, Gormenghast. The other thing I was going to look at when I looked at the beauty in place was this. This is another play that Anne Carson has written. This is a contemporary play that she's written. It's not really a translation of any Greek tragedy. She calls it a version of Helen by Euripides. So I guess it's a version of a Greek tragedy, but it's a very loose version. In here, Helen becomes, you know, she's, again, transformation. Helen transforms and she morphs into Marilyn Monroe. So this is an incredible play that's really reflecting on war, the legacy, the brutality of war, and in particular, the cost to women in war, you know, sexual violence, all of that sort of thing. The way we represent women at a time of war and blame women for things, like Helen was blamed for the whole of the Trojan War, and, you know, all of these sorts of things. This is a really powerful play, and I love the way she evokes this whole world and these characters. Very, very powerful. Believe it or not, on one page, Helen will be referred to as Marilyn Monroe, and then on the next page, she's referred to as Truman Capote. You know, that man with that high-pitched voice, that brilliant, witty man, almost like an Oscar Wilde type character. Always saying brilliant witticisms. He's described in this book as having a voice like a negligee, negligee falling off the shoulder. So yes, Helen of Troy in this is one moment Helen, and then she's Marilyn Monroe, and then she's Truman Capote. It's a brilliant little play. Norma Jean Baker of Troy by Anne Carson. It's beautiful. It's very short, but and this is one of the things I love about Greek tragedy, and this is of course echoing that as well. I love the compression of it. I'm a poet, so I am very drawn to compression. Give me Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness any day over a Dickens novel or over William Thackeray's Vanity Fair, anything like that. I really love, there's nothing like a beautifully written novella, and of course all poetry. I really am drawn to compression. And in comparison to most other examples of even tragedy, of tragic drama, even Shakespeare for example, Greek tragedy is very, very short. You can read most Greek plays in sort of 20 to 40 minutes, because when you went, as I said, to the theatre, you would get 3 plays and the starter play. So when you went to the theatre to perform that civic duty, you got 4 plays. So they were all very short. There's a great compression to them. And I really like that about this type of theatre. That compression is part of the tension, part of what makes, for me, Greek tragedy so perfect. And this is, for me, a perfect example of what a modern play can do, that wants to echo back to that architecture, that orientation that was developed by Aiskhylos, Sophocles and Euripides. It's a beautiful, beautiful play. Beauty in time. Whew. Beauty in time. I think for me, time, fantasy literature is always, often, as I said before, it is a very nostalgic, it can be a very conventional type of fiction, I guess. So its time is to be quite conventional and conservative, unfortunately, which is so curious that it's a genre that I am just so in love with. But, even the structure of fantasy, you can trace it all the way back to the 19th century to William Morris, who was a very committed utopian communist who spent, nearly all weekend, every weekend, out pamphleteering, giving lectures, talking to whoever would listen to him about communism. He spent his whole weekend, every single week, trying to mobilize the English working class for the great revolution as prophesied by Marx in the Manifesto and Das Kapital, Grundrisse. So fantasy literature, despite the fact that in its own time it is very conventional, there is always this other side to it. And then, of course, you've got the Bakkhai again. This is a play which is set... I think when Euripides wrote this is not a play that could have been set in Athens. A little bit like Shakespeare with his great tragedies, when he had to set them in Verona or, other places in Italy. He couldn't set them in England because it would have been too dangerous to write about them at home, and people would be saying, oh, what's he saying about me? Or am I reading this? Or, is he doing something nasty with the portrayal of Elizabeth? So it was much safer to project it right out and either set the play back in time with Julius Caesar, or of course over in Verona or somewhere else. And this is what Euripides did here. He could not, the Bakkhai are these women who get into drunken in remembrance of Dionysus, the god of wine, and they go out into the woods, into the bush, and they live together, dancing naked and revelry and lots of alcohol. And I think if he had have written this about Athenian women, he would have got into serious trouble. Remembering that women in Athens weren't even allowed to go to the theatre. Athenian women were literally kept inside in the privacy of the home. They were not allowed to walk the streets alone, unaccompanied by a male, an adult male. And it had to be an adult male, of course, who was a father or a brother, someone who could be trusted. And of course, Athenian women were all veiled as well. So this play is really interesting in terms of time, the way he's transported the whole thing to a completely different place. This is, of course, set in Thebes again. That was the great, one for the Athenian tragedians. Instead of setting a play in Athens where you might get into serious trouble if you were seen as making the wrong comment about the wrong person. So it was much safer to simply project the play out into Thebes or somewhere else. And that's, of course, exactly what he did here as well. The last prompt is the beauty in catharsis. Well, of course, beauty in catharsis, I had to look at Aristotle. For me, all fantasy writing is about catharsis. It is about cleansing, purgation, purification. For me, reading fantasy is just a great joy. It cleanses my palate and it ennobles me. I love fantasy literature, despite the fact that it is often very conventional and conservative. But if you're going to look at the great poetics of catharsis, the beauty in catharsis, purgation, purification, ritual purity, I had to go to Aristotle, of course, and the great work on poetics. For Aristotle, maybe one of the first great literary critics, wasn't he? Aristotle really began it all, doesn't he? And the poetics is just so important. Unlike Plato, who spent his whole time with so-called the ridiculous notions of idealism and that, everything we see outside isn't even real. It's just an imitation of what is real. So for Plato, poetry and drama, everything was just, it was so inferior. Because the problem with poetry for Plato, of course, was that not only was it a copy, but for Plato, poetry was a copy of a copy, because it wasn't even a copy of the ideal states. Poetry was a copy of, in that mimetic way, it was a copy of what's going on in our world, which was just a copy of the ideals behind the veil. So he dismissed poetry from the Republic because poetry was a copy of a copy. Oh my goodness, such nonsense. I'm not a great fan of Plato, really. Aristotle is my man. Aristotle, that first great philosopher, almost as a precursor to modern day phenomenology. Aristotle, in a sense, turned his back on all that nonsense from Plato of ideals and all that sort of stuff. Plato, he was the great describer, the categorizer, the definer. So he was the first great natural historian who would go to an island, a place, and would describe what was in front of him, the abundance. He was one of the first people to start bringing in categories, species, families of animals and plants. And he applied the same approach to books. He wrote about books in terms of great poetry or tragedy or comedy, all sorts of things. This is also incomplete, of course, because the poetics, we've lost at least one half of it, unfortunately. All we've got is what he wrote on the beginning point, orientating us to this whole mystery of tragedy. And of course, we've lost everything that he had to say, the other half that he had to say about comedy, unfortunately. But fortunately, we do have what he said about tragedy. And for Aristotle, of course, tragedy, the point of tragedy was catharsis. It was to induce in the audience that purification, that purging, that ritual cleansing. And for Aristotle, catharsis was achieved by inducing in the audience in equal measure fear and pity. And that was achieved by, in every play, there had to be a hinge, a moment where great fortune was transformed into unbearable suffering. And that hinge, that moment of transformation from good to bad, from fortune to suffering, that moment was not allowed to be induced by wickedness. It had to be, of course, the result of human fallibility or mutability. So for Aristotle, he was the first person who really came up with these ways of describing tragedy, describing how it works. What's the point of it? The work on poetics is just absolutely genius. And he really developed this notion of catharsis, that, that's the point of Greek tragedy. I guess it's a bit of a mystery how going to a play can really ritually cleanse us, just because we feel pity or fear. But yes, there have been books and books and books written on catharsis now, haven't there? And trying to expand on Aristotle and try and work out how this catharsis takes place. And, if that's the point of tragedy, because, the point of tragedy, wow, it goes back to Zeus, doesn't it? Zeus, one of the great dictums of Zeus was that men, sorry about that, not that gendered language, but for Zeus, men learn through suffering. Everything is about suffering. And these plays, oh wow, they revel in suffering, don't they? Greek tragedy. So catharsis for me, I have to go back to the great Aristotle and the Poetics. And I love these little green lower books. When I was a young adult, first starting at Sydney University, I looked at these and I just couldn't afford them. You know, these were always, they're half in English and you have the Greek on the other side. So you've got the English translation with the original Greek on the other side, and I always dreamed that I would be able to learn classical Greek and read the two, and I would get a whole collection of these Loeb classics. And you know, I've now started to buy some of the Loeb classics now that I do have a little bit more money, but unfortunately I've never learnt classical Greek. It's just, languages are just not the way my brain works. I'm not clever like Emily. Oh, I would love to be multilingual and have that abundance of literature and ways of experiencing and being in the world. But unfortunately, it's not my way of being in the world. I know I'm quite smart in some ways, but I'm also astoundingly illiterate and incompetent in many ways. And unfortunately, my brain doesn't really work linguistically to easily pick up other languages. And of course, English language speakers can become very lazy. It's very easy to be unilingual if your one language is English. So we can be very lazy about that. Plus, of course, I've never done any travel. I've never been out of Australia. So I haven't had those opportunities, I suppose, to immerse myself in other cultures and to learn language. But I have got access to the English translations, fortunately, thanks to people like Carson, Ruth Fainlight, and of course the great Stephen Halliwell, who I think did this translation of the Poetics. And I just adore Aristotle. I really, really enjoy reading Aristotle and spending time with him. And of course, catharsis with my Billy Blue. Oh my goodness. How many times have I tried to describe the impact, the complete transformation that this dog has brought to my life. Oh boy, I was in a bad place when I got him. And I'm serious. Within 2 weeks, I was a different person. I was transformed. Now, hopefully you can hear from the energy, the excitement in my voice as I talk about him. He's just starting to get settled. He's heard me say his name, I think, once too often. Oh, beautiful boy. Billy Blue. In terms of catharsis, my goodness, that dog purifies me. All I want to do now is get well and save the day for him, my beautiful Billy. Oh, I'm so pleased to have taken part in this tag. I was really excited to do this one, and I think you can hear from my voice, I was very excited to take part in this. I've been living with these ideas and thinking about it and reading these books and for over the last 2 weeks and getting ready to get to this point where this would be the day. So, beauty in books. This is my contribution to what has been a wonderful tag. Thank you, Emily and Ruben. You are just wonders. You've made my life so filled with happiness and joy, and I just love the welcome that you've extended to somebody like me. You've made a very anxious, awkward old man into someone full of wonder and pleasure and joy. So thank you, and bye for now.